You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
A lot these days about how war has been with us since civilization. We read that people have been fighting on the planet for 5,000 years, but it might just be the case that people have been fighting for a little bit longer. It might even be the case that it's not just people that fight, and that it's all types of people that have been fighting. I've been trying to understand a little bit about when and why humans fight. Naturally, I hit the books. I found one, and we're going to discuss it today with my guest. G'day listeners, it is Mick here from the Dead Prussian podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you also for your reviews on iTunes and all the support you've been showing us lately. I have noticed there's been some merchandise purchased. If you do purchase any of our merchandise, please feel free to jump on social media, take a photo of you with your purchases, unless it's from our underwear line. I don't need to see any photos of anyone in their boxes, and then send them through to us so that we can make sure that these sales are going well and the products look good. Of course, I don't have any of the products anymore because they're overpriced. Now, let's get to the business of the day. My guest today is Professor Azar Gat. He took his doctorate from the University of Oxford. He's been an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow in Germany, 3 times actually, Freiburg, Munich and Constance. I'm pretty sure they're the correct Australian pronunciation of those German words. He's been a Fulbright Fellow in the USA, and that was at Yale. A British Council Scholar in Britain, that was at Oxford. A Visiting Fellow at the Mershon Centre, the Ohio State University, that's in America for those Australians that don't know where that is. It's somewhere around the middle. The Goldman Visiting Israeli Professor at Georgetown, and the Koret Distinguished Israeli Fellow at the Hoover Institute, Stanford, and all my listeners are very familiar with the Hoover Institute at Stanford. Now, he was also twice the Chair of Department of Political Science at Tel Aviv University, and he's the founder and head of the Executive Master's Program in Diplomacy and Security and the International Masters in Security and Diplomacy at Tel Aviv. He is the incumbent of the Azir Weizmann Chair for National Security. Now, if you thought that was impressive, he's also published a couple of books. And by a couple, I mean the Australian couple, where it could mean anywhere from 2 to 7,000. He's published The Origins of Military Thought from Enlightenment to Clausewitz, The Development of Military Thought, the 19th Century, Fascist and Liberal Visions of War, Fuller, Littlehart, Dewey, and Other Modernists, British Armour Theory and the Rise of the Panzer Arm, Revising the Revisionists, A History of Military Thought from the Enlightenment to the Cold War, War in a Changing World, one of my particular favourites, War in Human Civilization, got me through a degree, that one. Victorious and Vulnerable, Why Democracy Won in the 20th Century and How It Is Still Imperiled. Nations, The Long History and Deep Roots of Political Ethnicity and Nationalism. Now, I've read at least one of those books, and I'm sure the rest are brilliant, but the one I'm reading at the moment and I'm finding fascinating, which caused me to email Azar, is The Causes of War and the Spread of Peace. But will war rebound? And we're going to get into that one today. He is also a major in the Israeli Army. Azar, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, you're our first guest from Israel, which is good. It means the show is spreading around the world. But before we start discussing the book I'm reading at the moment, your latest book, The Causes of War and the Spread of Peace, can you tell our listeners a little bit about what got you interested in studying and writing about war?
Well, I grew up in Israel, so war was, a major interest. If I look backward, it must have been it must be the answer, because I've been interested in war since I was 7, something like this, early elementary school. During the 6-Day War, I was 8. Then there was the Yom Kippur 1973 wars, and the rest of the story.
Yeah.
So the subject has always been with me.
It's interesting. I guess for a lot of modern academics, a lot of people are writing about war without having lived through it, but you've very much got a lived experience there. So I guess you'd be the perfect person to answer my question on why do people go to war?
Well, first, let's see why they don't go to war, because there is the intuitive answer of many people as to why people go to war is that we have such aggression is an instinct of some sort, so we are bound, which is bound to explode at some moment. This is a very deep-seated intuition that people have. But people need to be reminded that, for example, let's take the cliche that the Swedes and the Swiss haven't fought for 2 centuries, and they don't see any sign of deprivation on this account. And we don't need the Swiss and the Swedes. Most of us have never fought or very rarely engage in violence, and we don't exhibit any kind of deprivation on that account. But try to deny us of food for, say, more than a few hours, or try to deny us of sex for, what shall we say, a few days, and see how we react. And I inquired with some Swedes and Swiss, and they confirmed my suspicion on that account. So the reason is, it's not that we have an instinct. The reason is that what we have is violence and war, which is collective violence, are all means for attaining whatever purpose that we want to achieve. So we have peaceful cooperation, we have peaceful competition, and we have violence. And these are the three behavioral strategies that we may resort to. Now, it depends on the conditions, on the circumstances, on our reading of them, on which strategy we choose. This also accounts for the fact that you see that the prevalence of war changes widely between society depending on the circumstances. If the circumstances that gave preference to the peaceful options are stronger, then people would opt in this direction. And if the society in question encourages violence, we see the kind of violence that is unfortunately prevalent, still prevalent in some corners of the world.
It's interesting. The things that motivate people and deprive people, they seem like very basic needs. So I guess my next question would be, how long have people been fighting each other for?
Well, the evidence is that they've always fought each other. They've also cooperated and competed peacefully. So all strategies have always been present. Our species, Homo sapiens, exists for about 150 to 200,000 years. But we know this also from other primates, say our closest cousins, the chimpanzees. And the most direct observation that we have about our ancestors actually come from your own continent, from Australia, where the Aborigines were isolated from the rest of the world, lived as hunter-gatherers. That is the kind of existence that prevailed before the adoption of agriculture some 10,000 years ago, before the rise of states some 5,000 years ago. And the Aborigines isolated here, all of them, here I mean Australia, all of them hunter-gatherers, no agriculturalists, no pastoralists, no states. The evidence showed that they fought each other throughout the continent, in all the ecological niches, in the tropical north, in the temperate south, in the desert-like center, in all corners of the continent, of this huge continent of yours. The Aboriginal tribes fought each other.
And it's interesting, in your book you talk about even the Tasmanian Aboriginals, and we've actually had an episode where we interviewed someone about the war between the colonists and the Aboriginals themselves. And they were perhaps the most isolated human group known, ever discovered. And they were still quite warlike, and some of their strategies related to some of the topics you've already raised.
That's right. The strategies of pre-state societies have always been the same. That is, this was the primacy of the ambush and the raid, mostly the night raid, when when the raid surprised the other tribe sleeping in its camp, so that that fighting was intrinsically asymmetrical, maximize the advantage for the attackers, minimize the risk. So what we see in all these, what is known as primitive warfare, it centers on the ambush and the raid. Battle is more infrequent, and it's also less risky because the sides keep their distance so that they themselves are not hurt.
Yeah, it seems like a smart tactic. It seems
So,
lot safer than taking someone on head on. So it seems like people have been fighting for a long time, and war's been about for a long time. Is it on the rise, or is it in the decline?
So there have been several books over the past decades claiming, as I do, that war has been in decline. It's not so clear since when, and it's not so clear why. And I'm arguing that war has been in decline since about the beginning of the 19th century, with one major exception, and that is the two world wars, which is a monumental exception that needs explaining. We are all familiar, I hope, with the concept of the long peace. That is the peace that prevails between the great powers since 1945.
Yeah.
And this peace seems exceptional and unexceptional because we believe that we know the reason. And the reason being, obviously, nuclear deterrence. But the fact of the matter is that the second longest peace ever among the great powers was between 1871 and 1914. This is 43 years. That's in Europe, the great powers also. And the third longest peace ever occurred just before that, between 1815 and 1854. That is 39 years. Nothing like this had ever happened before. And what we need to explain, I see these three long periods of peace consecutively and increasingly longer as something which is which belongs to the same phenomenon, and the challenge that we face is to explain this phenomenon.
And how do we explain the phenomenon?
Well, again, the intuition that most people would have is that modern war has become more costly in terms of lives and destruction and costs and so forth. I mean, financial costs.
Yeah.
This is our intuition, but this intuition is wrong.
Okay.
Throughout history, wars have been no less, sometimes more destructive than our most destructive wars. And what I mean is not in absolute terms. The World War II, for example, simply involved many states all around the world. So it's natural that the overall number is high. But what I refer to as relative costs or relative casualties is the percentage of the population in question that got killed in war. Because it doesn't matter if there is one great war or there are a multitude of wars between, say, two states, each of them suffering, or in all of them, the societies in question suffer very high casualties. So, for example, in the 30 Years' War, that is in Europe, that is 1618 to 1648, it's estimated that the population of Germany, which was the main theater of operation, fell by between 15 to 30%. Even the lower estimates estimate is more than Germany's losses in both world wars. And we have many other examples. I don't know how much time you have, but again, there are throughout history, there are many cases where society suffered as much as 30% of the population, which is more than, say, than what the Soviet Union suffered in World War II. Only about a sixth of the population. I say only about this horrific war and horrific casualty list. But this is the stuff of history.
Yeah, so it seems interesting that, because people often look at wars in absolute terms, but if you take it as a percentage, you get a very, very different story.
That's right. And let me tell you one more reason why our intuitions mislead us, and that is we think about modern weapons as particularly destructive, and this, of course, is particularly true of nuclear weapons. But with conventional modern weapons, we tend to forget that the increase in effectiveness affects both sides of the equation. That is both the offensive and the defensive.
Yep.
So, for example, we have mechanized armor, which decreases our vulnerability. Or we have electronic countermeasures, which deflect enemy missiles, and so forth. So it's not true that modern weaponry is more deadly if we remember the other side of the equation.
Okay, that's interesting. Technology doesn't just increase our vulnerability to weapons, but it also increases our ability to protect ourselves from weapon systems.
Absolutely.
And so if war's in the decline, does it mean that societies will become safer and less violent? Or is there anything to indicate that, is war going to come back as a carryover champ?
So let me first say why I think that why if it's not that war is more costly, why is it that war has been declining since 1815?
Yeah.
And the reason for that, in my view, is the most revolutionary change in human history since the adoption of agriculture, and this is the Industrial Revolution and the processes of modernization that it brought in its wake. So one of the main effects of this revolution was that our standard of living, as expressed, say, in production per capita, has risen since in the countries that have been affected by the change, that is, in the developed world. Our standard of living has risen by between 30 and 50. So whereas in the past, the sum total of wealth was fixed, it didn't grow. This is known as the Malthusian trap, after Thomas Malthus in Britain, who said that that all the rising production is absorbed by rising population. This is no longer the case. This was the case in pre-industrial societies, but it's no longer the case. So we now live in societies of plenty, and plenty increases by investment at home and by trade. So it's not that war has become more costly, it is peace that has become more rewarding. It's the other side of the equation. It simply pays us more to invest in peaceful production than engage in war.
That's interesting. I guess it makes sense though, doesn't it? The greater benefit. It is, it's what benefits us greater. It's an investment in peace. Therefore, we'll go down that line.
Absolutely, and it's also, it makes sense. If we are all comfortable in our comfortable lives, why would we want to go to war? If people live on the brink of existence and they see, wealth just across the border, they have a strong temptation to cross the borders. You still see it in some of the poor parts of the world, but in the developed world, in the affluent world, why would we? We have everything that we need. I mean, it's very difficult to convince people that it's worthwhile to go to fight in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Especially when they're leaving very comfortable lives to go do these things. So I guess my next question is then, would we see a rebound if war became the more profitable option?
So I think that what we see is a story of two worlds. We have the developed world, and it's very difficult to see the circumstances in which, other than self-defense, in which people would want to go to war. So what we see is that within the developed world, the option of war is practically non-existent. People simply cannot even visualize it. Just think of the current reality whereby, say, Holland or Belgium no longer fear a German invasion or a French invasion for that matter. It seems this is historically entirely unprecedented, and still this is not even an option. Or again, what protects Canada from occupation and annexation by the United States? People do not pay attention to these facts, but the reality is that the United States, in principle, could have conquered Canada, but still none of the side even dream about this option. So what we have is the death of war within the developed world, that is, within two developed countries, and also the death of civil war. Pay attention that even in the developed world, the occurrence of civil war no longer happens. And the main reason is that, there is now a general recognition that if, part of the population that defines itself in national terms wants to secede, so be it. May not be happy about it, but we won't send in the troops. So this is true for Canada with respect to Quebec, and it's true for Britain with respect to Scotland.
Yep.
And it's true even in Spain with respect to Catalonia and the Basque Country. This was not the case in the past. So we have the developed world, which is within itself. It no longer fights. And we have the undeveloped world. And you see that the zone of war is always concentrated in the least developed parts of the world. That is Central Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and so forth. These are the risky parts of the world, which sometimes also involve developed countries, but for reasons that come from the undeveloped parts of the world. So that's first the general picture that we see around us. Now, regarding the risk of war, in my opinion, there are mainly two sources of such risk. One is those great powers that embrace or claim to have an alternative vision of modernity, and which are still far behind in terms of development. So we are talking China.
Yep.
We are talking Russia.
Okay. Yep.
China is still has about the production per capita is still about $8,000 per capita, as compared to 35 and onward in the developed world, and upward. So China, we still do not know how it develops. This is the great question of the 21st century, as in Australia should be even more aware than others.
Yeah, big topic here.
And we have Russia. This is one challenge, huge challenge to be sure.
Yeah.
And we'll have to see how China develops during the 21st century. And the other challenge is unconventional terror. Yep. Terror by itself is a public relation act. But if it becomes unconventional, this is going to be a radically different proposition.
And I guess the war that we see, there's the term the global war on terror, but that's a very different sort of kind of war manifested. it's almost going back to the roots of warfare, where it's non-state formed bodies of people conducting organised violence rather than a formed state.
That's right. But this is obviously new, but not that new. Because earlier in history, you always had non-state actors playing a very active role in war. So you had pirates, and you had bandits, and you had the mercenary armies that sometimes took an independent role and simply followed their own leaders. And this was still the case in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. I remind you that the wars of religion that we had in Europe is pretty much what we see now in the Middle East. So this is not something new, entirely new. It's true that from the 17th century onward, states throughout Europe monopolized violence. But what we may see now, because of unconventional weapons, because of conventional weapons filtering down to below the state level, what we might see is the return of non-state actors, and even scenarios of the kind that previously have been reserved to fiction, of the James Bond genre. Individual and small groups in possession of, say, biological weapons, God forbid, but that's a very strong potential. And threatening world peace.
It's interesting. I think we could probably discuss this topic for, well, if not days, probably weeks, months. But I know our listeners are probably getting a bit twitchy to see what your answer would be to the final question. So we'll move to the final question, Azar, and this is the bill every guest gets for coming on the show, and it relates to our mission to continue the conversation and debate about war and define it in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. So I ask each guest this, and I'm going to ask you this now. Can you finish the sentence, war is?
War is a continuation of human desires by violent means.
Is a brilliant definition.
Thank you.
No, that is excellent. I think our listeners will love that one quite a bit, because our listeners that have done their reading will know exactly where that's been adapted from, and those listeners that haven't done their reading, well, you know what you should be doing. Look, Azar, thank you very much for coming on the show and having a discussion with me about some of the things I haven't really understood yet about war. I mean, I think the idea and the premise about war being the less attractive option at the moment, I think that's actually good for everyone. Let's hope it doesn't go the other way. And we'll just have to watch this space, is what I kind of interpreted from where we might be going down the road. But thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, listeners, thanks for downloading and listening to this show. As you know, my statistics just need you to download it. So when you listen, that's a bonus. Jump on board Amazon, Booktopia, Book Depository, wherever you buy your books. And you can find all of Azar's books, but most importantly, The Cause of War and the Spread of Peace. But Will War Rebound? It's quite a good book, and for anyone that's read Ian Morris's War, What Is It Good For?, this book is an excellent follow-on to that one. I found myself thoroughly enjoying this book. Now, please listen to War for Idiots, the other show produced by this studio that includes myself and a less funny co-host. Until next time, though, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.